Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a grand ball or a windswept meadow of dandelion dreams, but with livestock, dowries, and the smell of turnips at market. You're single. It's the 1300s, and your best shot at flirting today might involve a comment about someone's ability to carry a water bucket without tripping. You live in a world where the word romance means a lot of sighing, waiting, and, if you're lucky, a carved spoon with only one crack in it. You're standing in a muddy village square, your boots soaked from last week's rain that never really stopped. Your breath fogs the air, and you're dodging geese with more attitude than your aunt. You glance across the path and catch a glimpse of someone balancing onions on their head like it's a crown. Your heart skips, but you're reminded flirting is risky, marriages are contracts, and you, dear dreamer, are probably not marrying for love. You probably won't survive this with your dignity intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're about 14, which means, in medieval terms, you're already late to the matchmaking game. You've got calloused hands, a family that's eyeing their neighbor's daughter, and a sheep that refuses to cooperate with any romantic plans. You've never heard the word date, except when it refers to a fruit, and even that's a luxury you've probably never tasted. There's someone you like. Maybe they smile when they grind grain at the mill, or maybe they once helped your sibling when the pig got loose. Either way, your crush is developing inconveniently fast for a time when emotion is considered about as useful as a soggy log. Your mother notices your glances and begins quietly pricing geese. Your father mutters something about alliances and goats, and you're just wondering whether brushing your tunic makes a difference. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers genuinely understood emotional love as we know it, or if affection was simply something that happened after the dowry cleared. A friend dares you to talk to them. Your crush, that is, not the chicken. You try. You fail. You end up asking whether the weather affects turnip flavor. That's when Margaret appears. Not your crush. Margaret the chaperone. Margaret the relentless. She appears to monitor your intentions like a human lie detector wrapped in wool. You decide to carve something, not a love poem. Those get intercepted. You carve a spoon, a modest one, not too fancy. Don't want them thinking you're rich, but smooth, practical, romantic. If they accept it, maybe there's a chance. If they use it to feed the dog, you'll know where you stand. You pass the spoon during a group bread-making session. Your palms sweat. Your voice cracks. They smile. Or maybe they wince. Hard to tell with the smoke from the oven. Later, while you're helping to shovel out the cow pen, because nothing says adolescent crush like manure, you wonder whether it was worth it. But then you remember, this is how things work here. Romance is not about grand gestures. It's about surviving long enough to offer someone a half-decent turnip and hope they don't laugh. You dream that night, not of kisses or moonlit dances, but of working the same plot of land side by side, of shared chores, of two pairs of boots leaving muddy prints to the barn and back. And in that dream, your crush doesn't run. They just nod, pick up a bucket, and walk beside you. In this world, love doesn't arrive in sonnets. It arrives in silence, in glances, in moments so small they can be lost between raindrops. But when they land, they sink deep, right between the ribs and the wool. A mainstream fact you might not have known. In many medieval villages, local custom and the manorial court had more control over your marriage than your own desires. The lord of the manor sometimes even needed to approve the match. Still, that doesn't stop you. Tomorrow you'll try again, maybe with a slightly nicer spoon, maybe a better comment about the weather. Maybe you'll ask about that onion balancing trick. And just maybe next time, Margaret won't be watching. So here's the thing. You're not in charge. Not really. Your heart might flutter every time the smith's daughter laughs at something not even remotely funny, but none of it matters. Not in the ways you'd hope. Because the medieval dating scene isn't about butterflies in your stomach. It's about cows and wool and your uncle's opinion on dowries. You wake up to your mother whispering with the neighbor. They're not gossiping. They're negotiating over you. You're not at the table. You are the table. The conversation is quiet, coded. They have a productive goat, your mother says. Good hands for weaving. That's high praise. You, meanwhile, are outside trying to remember if you brushed the straw out of your hair. In medieval society, marriage wasn't about choosing who to love. It was about survival and property consolidation, especially for peasants whose holdings were as small as their privacy. Marriages were often arranged between families to make sure the fields had enough hands and the goats had the right neighbors. Historians still debate how much say young people actually had in their matches. Some believe parental control was absolute. Others suggest that soft rebellion was more common than records admit. Still, if you're a peasant, there's wiggle room. Sometimes, let's say you're a girl. Your family's looking for someone with a patch of land and knees that still bend after harvest. Romantic, right? But wait, there's more. A good candidate doesn't just have strong arms. He has to be of good character, which roughly translates to hasn't stolen turnips or passed out in the churchyard. You, meanwhile, might be evaluated on your ability to churn butter and keep opinions to yourself. You try to be silent but pleasant, not too cheerful, not too quiet, just enough mystery to imply competence. If you're a noble, forget even that tiny freedom. You've probably been betrothed since you were 7. You've never spoken to your future spouse. You once saw their portrait. It looks suspiciously like a potato with eyebrows. Your family doesn't care. The match increases your family's border by 3 ox lengths. It also erases some debts and elevates your father's status at court. Whether or not the groom has any conversational skill or even teeth is irrelevant. The negotiations are handled by your father, your mother, a priest, a cousin who once studied law, and the other family's livestock appraiser. You sit in the corner with a teacup, nodding when asked if you like embroidery. In some towns, a public notice would be posted announcing the betrothal. In others, it was whispered over bread and sealed with a blessing from the local priest and 2 goats with excellent reputations. But there's one saving grace. Sometimes things fall through. Dowries fail. Suitors get cold feet. Someone dies dramatically in a hunting accident or joins a monastery. And in that gap, in that flicker of uncertainty, maybe, you get to breathe. Today, your father pulls you aside. They've agreed to 3 hens, 1 small pig, and the use of the lower pasture for 2 seasons. You nod solemnly. Inside, you're screaming. Because you liked someone else, someone who carves things with surprising skill, someone who offered you a spoon and didn't immediately insult your family's roof. But that doesn't matter, not unless you plan on running away to a convent, or feigning madness, or being very, very patient. Oh, and if you're hoping for an engagement ring, forget it. You're lucky if there's a belt, some linen, maybe a hair ribbon. Jewelry is for nobles, and even then, it's more insurance policy than romantic gesture. A quirky fact, in some parts of medieval Europe, a hand-fasting ceremony could bind two people temporarily, essentially a trial marriage. If it worked, great. If not, they walked away after a year and a day. Kind of like medieval speed dating, but with more sheep. And what if you're the second son? No land, no inheritance. You might be encouraged to join the church, or marry someone with a lot of geese and low standards. Or maybe you fall for someone wildly inappropriate and risk total scandal. But we'll save that story for later. For now, the arrangements are moving forward. You're invited to the barn, not to meet your betrothed, but to count the livestock involved in the deal. It smells like the opposite of romance. The pig seems judgmental. The goat is definitely laughing. Your parents are smiling. Your stomach is twisting. Later, in the half-light of your loft, you sit with a candle stub and think, is this it? Is this the start of your life? You don't feel ready. You don't feel much at all, just the weight of expectation and the scratch of hay. Maybe someday, love will come. Maybe your marriage will turn into something kind. But tonight, you lie awake and wonder what it would be like to choose, just once, for yourself. Outside, the wind shakes the shutters. A chicken complains in the dark. And you hold the carved spoon under your blanket and dream of another kind of world. Your chest is tight, not because you've been hauling sacks of barley, though you've done that too. It's the kind of tightness that comes from thinking too much about someone you've barely spoken to, someone who brushed past you at the well and smiled like they didn't notice how crooked your hat was. But don't get ahead of yourself. This isn't the modern world. You can't just write a flirty note or ask them to meet you under the stars. In fact, asking anything is suspicious. Your feelings, unfortunately, are about to be turned into performance art. Welcome to the curious, emotionally exhausting spectacle of courtly love. You're not a peasant anymore. Let's pretend for a moment that you're a knight. Shiny armor, a big horse that doesn't like you, a growing collection of poetry you pretend not to care about. You're supposed to be brave, stoic, mildly terrifying in battle. But all you can think about is a certain noble woman who looks entirely too graceful while pretending not to notice you. She's married, of course. They always are. And that's exactly what makes this whole thing safe. Courtly love isn't about marriage. It's not about mutual affection or healthy communication. It's about suffering, publicly, elegantly, and from a distance. You choose someone above your station or firmly unavailable, and then you pine dramatically while writing rhymed couplets by candlelight. Historians still argue whether courtly love was a genuine emotional outlet or just a social game played by bored nobles with too much mead and not enough privacy. Your friends think it's hilarious. You once challenged a guy to a duel because he looked at her for too long. The lady in question hasn't spoken more than 5 words to you, but you've written 14 verses comparing her to the moon, the sun, and a rare goose with golden feathers. She hasn't acknowledged any of them. You take this as encouragement. A mainstream fact: the tradition of courtly love emerged in 12th century France and was especially popular in troubadour poetry. Knights would swear fealty to a noble lady and perform brave deeds in her honor, even if she didn't know his name. So, you keep at it. You wear her colors at tournaments. You glance mournfully in her direction at feasts. If she passes you a token, a handkerchief, a ribbon, a vaguely pointed stare, it's enough to make you write another stanza. Meanwhile, she plays her part perfectly. Aloof, distant, unattainable in that glacial, terrifying way that noble women seem to master by age 15. She might send back a letter, or a poem, or nothing at all, and you'll still carry her token into battle, telling yourself it gives you strength instead of saddle rash. There's a certain comfort in this strange arrangement. You don't have to worry about actually knowing her. You don't risk disappointment. You're in love with an idea, and that idea, thankfully, doesn't snore or criticize your sword technique. But let's be honest, your poetry is bad. You compare her eyes to candles on a rainy night, which is confusing. You rhyme desire with fire at least 9 times. One of your stanzas sounds suspiciously like it was copied from Brother Jeffrey's book of sermons. Still, it's not about the quality. It's about the ritual. Courtly love offers something dangerous but safe, passionate but staged. It's love with training wheels and armor. A quirky fact: some knights actually engaged in competitions to see who could suffer the most dramatically in love. One even locked himself in a tower voluntarily to prove the depth of his devotion. Spoiler: it did not go well. Occasionally, things go too far. A glance lingers too long. A message is intercepted. Someone makes a bold gesture, and suddenly what was once poetic is now scandalous. Remember, if your courtly love turns physical, it stops being art and becomes adultery, a serious offense involving public shame and awkward confessions. You're not trying to start a war. You're just trying to feel something in a life of chainmail and boredom. So you keep it distant, safe, beautiful. You ride through forests thinking of her. You stare at the stars, whisper her name, and wonder what it would be like if she ever said yours aloud. You know this won't end with a kiss. At best, it ends with a nod. At worst, it ends with you bleeding in a field, still clutching her ribbon like a lovesick raccoon. And yet, you wouldn't trade it. Because in a world where most marriages are spreadsheets with livestock, courtly love lets you pretend, just for a moment, that love can be grand and tragic and yours. You write one more poem before sleep. It's terrible. You don't care. You press your hand to your chest, whisper her name like it's a spell, and dream not of victory, but of a glance across the hall, a glimmer of recognition, and the soft weight of a ribbon tied to your sword. You think about her glove more than you should, not because it's especially fine. It's just linen, maybe lightly scented with lavender, possibly sweat, but because she gave it to you, or dropped it, or lost it near your horse on purpose, or maybe not. That's the maddening part. You don't know. And if you ask directly, congratulations. You've violated the entire point of medieval flirtation. This is the era of the romantic token, and you've just been gifted one. Maybe. You keep the glove tucked in your tunic like it's a relic. You haven't told anyone about it except your most trustworthy friend, who now refers to it only as the artifact and insists you get it blessed. You're not alone in this confusion. Across the kingdom, Knights, nobles, and even enterprising peasants are exchanging objects like they're encrypted messages, because they are. A ribbon, a brooch, a spoon, a carved comb, a handkerchief stitched during an exceptionally boring sermon, all fair game. Historians still argue whether these items carried agreed-upon meanings or if everyone was just improvising and hoping they weren't proposing marriage by accident. You try to remember what each object is supposed to symbolize. A glove might mean admiration or challenge, or that she ran out of pockets. A token worn over your heart is the ultimate compliment. Unless it's too obvious, then it's a scandal. Here's a mainstream fact. During tournaments, knights often wore a lady's token tied to their lance, helmet, or chest. It was considered both an honor and a declaration of, "I suffer beautifully for you." But this isn't a tournament. This is your actual life. And you're holding a glove that may or may not be a declaration of interest. You respond in kind, carefully selecting something meaningful. A carved pendant you made yourself, shaped like a flower. Or maybe a duck. It's hard to say. Symbolism is subjective. You slip it into her saddlebag while everyone is distracted during Mass. You don't breathe for the next 20 minutes. She finds it the next day. She doesn't say a word. But later, at the feast, she's wearing it, tied to her belt. Not hidden, not flaunted, just there. You nearly choke on your stew. A quirky tidbit. Some tokens were edible. A sugared almond or a spiced fig tucked into a handkerchief could mean anything from "I adore you" to "you looked hungry." Romantic ambiguity, medieval style. But tokens weren't without risk. Give one to the wrong person and suddenly you're betrothed to the miller's cousin with the unfortunate mole and a penchant for staring. Receive a token you don't want. Good luck returning it. There's no medieval protocol for "it's not you, it's your lineage." Still, you press on. You craft a second token. This one more daring. A scrap of embroidered cloth with a single line of poetry stitched in crooked letters. You're no tailor, but your hands don't shake when you work on it. Not until it's time to pass it along. You leave it where she'll find it. In her falconry glove, between the leather and the lining. If she notices, she says nothing. But 3 days later, you spot your poem tied to the hilt of her riding sword. Victory? Not quite. But in this world, that's as loud as love gets. The entire system is built on plausible deniability. You didn't say you loved her. You didn't declare anything. You're just two people quietly exchanging objects and hoping no one ruins the delicate balancing act by being emotionally direct. There are others watching, of course, always. A chaperone, a priest, a maid who suddenly takes a great interest in sweeping near the window. So you learn to send messages with your eyes, your posture, the way you hold her token when you think no one sees. There's something intoxicating about it all. You can't speak freely. You can't act openly. But in these tiny controlled gestures, you feel more connection than you ever could in a grand speech. Because when every act is a risk, every act matters. You start to notice other couples or near couples doing the same. A stable boy passes a girl a comb, worn smooth from years of use. A baker's apprentice drops off a bundle of firewood tied with blue twine. A noble woman nods, ever so slightly, when a knight adjusts the ribbon on his sword. This is a world of signs, of signals, of objects carrying weight far beyond their material value. And even when you're not exchanging tokens, you're thinking about them. What if you gave her a music box, 2 forward, a piece of your tunic, Too dramatic. A drawing? Too obvious. A pine cone? Maybe poetic if you explain it properly. One night, you dream that she gives you something real, not imagined. A strand of hair wrapped in a twist of thread. It glows in your dream like gold. You wake with your heart pounding. There's nothing under your pillow but straw and a flea, but you check anyway. Because tokens are never just tokens. They're stories you tell yourself, proof that you're seen, that you're remembered, that you matter, even if just for a moment. So you polish the duck pendant flower thing and tuck it back into your sleeve, not because she'll see it again, but because you like remembering that once, in a world ruled by contracts and silence, someone wore something you made and didn't take it off. You're trying to mind your own business, just tending the garden, sorting barley, failing to catch the chicken again. But every move you make, every glance, feels like it's being documented by a committee of elderly relatives and holy men. Welcome to medieval romance surveillance, because in this town, love isn't just personal, it's public property. Margaret sees everything, not the Margaret you mentioned once in jest. No, this is the Margaret, your chaperone, your neighbor, your aunt, your parish busybody, and local gossip database rolled into one person. She's always just walking by, just behind you, just asking an innocent question while examining your hands for signs of secret spoon carving. You try to make eye contact with someone across the courtyard. Margaret appears with a cough. You linger 2 seconds too long at the well. Margaret offers an impromptu prayer. You smile, just smile, at a festival. Margaret brings up St. Agatha's tragic tale of forbidden feelings and terrible consequences. She means well, but also she absolutely doesn't. Because gossip is not just idle chatter here, it's social currency. And romance in this tightly wound world is risky business. Historians still argue whether gossip served more as a moral enforcement tool or a subtle form of power redistribution, especially among women who had little direct control over public life. Either way, it was effective and loud. You learn to be careful. You learn that glances are more powerful than gestures, and silence is safer than words. Even your footsteps feel suspicious. If they echo near the chapel and someone happens to be leaving Mass, congratulations, someone's mother now has a theory about you. Mainstream fact: in many medieval towns, the church kept records not just of births and deaths, but of misconduct, especially related to courtship, infidelity, or anything unseemly. Yes, even your romantic life might have a file. You try to adapt. You avoid the same market stall as your person of interest. You speak louder around others, never quieter. You start using metaphors when discussing anything vaguely emotional. How's the weather becomes still gray but hopeful. How's your heart becomes, well, that's not a question anyone asks out loud. Still, your feelings sneak out. In a shared glance during prayers, in a pause at the doorframe, in the way you pass a loaf of bread with just a little too much care. You try to ignore the whispers. They stood close at the maypole, someone says. I heard he looked at her twice. You hear your name in fragments behind doors, under breaths, on the wind that smells faintly of cabbage and regret. A quirky tidbit: some medieval communities employed honor courts where neighbors could file complaints based on observations. These courts didn't just punish theft, they handled romantic behavior. Think of it as the original comment section, but in real life and with pitchforks. You start to feel cornered, like your emotions are under glass. You want to say something real, do something daring, but Margaret, and the priest, and Margaret again. So instead, you retreat into ritual. You start attending Mass more often, not for confession, but because that's when they are there. Not next to you, of course. That would be scandalous. But across the aisle, a safe distance. Eyes forward, only the occasional side glance when the incense smoke covers your field of vision. They see you. You know they do. Once your eyes meet during the hymn, you both look away immediately, but you don't forget. This becomes the pattern. Not love in action, but love in caution. Quiet signals, careful choices, emotional Morse code wrapped in wool and propriety. And sometimes the eyes watching you aren't hostile. Sometimes they're amused. A grandmother who remembers her own token exchanges. A merchant who nods quietly as if to say, "I won't tell." Even Margaret once lets you linger for a few extra seconds. She doesn't smile, but she doesn't interrupt. Maybe she remembers too. And in that small grace, you find a kind of strength. You learn how to live inside restriction, how to feel deeply without being seen feeling anything at all. It's exhausting, but it's also oddly powerful. Because when you do make a move, when you hand off that ribbon, when your fingers brush for a half second over a shared basket, it means everything. You've trained your body and mind to be cautious, so any slip is deliberate. Any risk is real. You dream sometimes of a world without watchers, where you can walk side by side down the path without causing murmurs, where love doesn't need to be encrypted in fabric and glances. But for now, you live here, and here, love grows in the spaces between eyes, not in the open fields. And so, you walk slower near the courtyard. You avoid Margaret's line of sight when possible, but you never stop watching and hoping and waiting for the moment you're brave enough to risk a whisper. You shouldn't be doing this. You know it. You tell yourself this every time you look at the piece of parchment hidden in your boot, the one that smells faintly of candle wax, desperation, and crushed rosemary. It's a letter, not just a note, but a letter, written carefully over 3 nights with ink you bartered for, and words you rewrote a dozen times. You didn't sign it. Of course not. But you laced it with every thought you couldn't say aloud. And now you're going to deliver it. Or die trying. This is dangerous. The church frowns upon unchaperoned emotional expression. Letters can be intercepted, misinterpreted, or, for the truly unlucky, read aloud at the altar before Sunday Mass. But still, here you are, crouching behind a stone wall near the kitchen garden, timing your breath with the clatter of firewood. You see them. They're alone. For once, you don't hand it to them. You tuck it in the fold of their cloak as they turn. A brush. A second. Gone. They keep walking. You stand absolutely still, pretending to be fascinated by a goat chewing bark off a fence post. Historians still argue whether love letters were a widespread phenomenon or more of a noble class indulgence. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, restricted but persistent, because when people aren't allowed to speak their hearts, they find ways to write them. Mainstream fact: surviving love letters from the Middle Ages, such as those between Eloise and Abelard, are remarkably poetic, deeply emotional, and at times surprisingly modern in tone. Your letter isn't like theirs. You didn't quote Augustine or Aristotle, but you did say, "I remember your hand brushing mine like a wind before a storm." And that felt close enough to Scripture. You run home. Your heart beats in your ears. You're both terrified and thrilled because now it's out there. They know. Or they will know. If they read it. If they don't toss it in the fire. Or worse, show it to their brother. The one with the eyebrows of a judgmental falcon. The next day, there's no word. No glance. Nothing. The day after, still nothing. You convince yourself you're imagining things. You decide to forget the letter, forget your stupid metaphor about apples and longing, and go back to your normal life of chickens, frost, and overboiled stew. Then, 3 days later, tucked into your basket of firewood is a scrap of parchment. Your name isn't on it, but the handwriting is careful. The message is brief. I remembered your hand too. You nearly dropped the wood. It's begun. Now comes the dance of the forbidden exchange. Letters passed inside loaves of bread, slipped into hymnals, hidden beneath saddle straps or inside the folds of altar cloths. Nothing direct, everything precise. You write cautiously. You don't name names. You speak in metaphors. The garden is colder than before, but I saw a flower still growing, or the dove circled twice today. It's nonsense to anyone else. To the two of you, it's a conversation. You learn how to fold messages like a spy. You rub herbs into the parchment to mask the scent. You adopt code names. You live inside the thrill of it and the risk. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval love letters were disguised as prayers, written with enough piety to fool a casual observer, but with hidden meanings clear to the recipient. You try it once. Blessed be the hands that gather kindling. Not exactly gospel, but it'll do. You both start quoting psalms in public. Harmless? Maybe. But there's one about longing for water, like the deer. And after the third repetition, Margaret starts squinting suspiciously again. One afternoon, during the feast of St. Martin, you receive a note hidden inside a roast chestnut. Yes, a chestnut. It's warm, slightly greasy, and filled with a message that says only, "You looked happy today." That made me happy. You walk home barefoot without realizing it. Historians agree on this much. Emotional intimacy in the Middle Ages had to be built slowly, carefully, and often in secret, which means every word exchanged had a value modern relationships might never understand. But secrecy has its shadows. One day, you misplace a letter. You retrace your steps like you've lost gold. You find it, thank the saints, wedged under a crate by the tavern. No one saw. Probably. Still, it shakes you. This could all vanish. One loose tongue, one misplaced parchment, one sermon about temptation, and you could be exiled from more than just love. So you begin to memorize instead. You write the letters, yes, but you also learn to carry the messages in your bones. You remember their phrases, their rhythms, the little quirks in their spelling. You dream their sentences. You hear their voice even when you're alone in the woods, gathering firewood that suddenly smells like rosemary. And when winter comes, and the letters slow because of frost and watchful eyes, you survive on the memory of ink and words whispered through paper. You light the hearth with dry logs and dry eyes, and you smile as you stir the soup because they wrote to you, and you to them. And sometimes that's more powerful than a kiss in the open. The festival has arrived. There's flour in your hair, mud on your boots, and the distinct smell of roast meat hovering over the entire village. A maypole's been erected in the center of the square. ribbons fluttering like eager signals to the gods of awkward romance. It's the one time of year where you can flirt without fear. Well, with less fear. Margaret is still watching. Of course. But for now, there's color, there's music, there's a cart filled with overly ambitious pies, and most importantly, there's proximity, the rare and holy moment where social rules bend just enough to let you accidentally fall next to someone you've been writing psalm-coded love notes to all winter. You're not alone. Every unmarried person in the village has spent days preparing. Clothes washed, hair braided, teeth brushed with mint leaves and prayers. Even the livestock looks suspiciously festive. You spot them. They're by the bread stall, trying not to laugh at a child who just fell into a vat of apples. You pretend not to notice. You also walk into a low-hanging banner in the process, so the casual effect is somewhat lost. This is your chance. The dances are beginning. You shuffle into the line like a soldier stepping onto a battlefield made of straw, sweat, and flute music. Historians still argue whether these festivals served as sanctioned spaces for romantic initiation or simply as distractions from the crushing weight of agrarian repetition. Either way, people flirted, danced, and occasionally made promises they couldn't keep after the ale wore off. Mainstream fact: many medieval European communities held spring and summer festivals, especially around May Day and Midsummer, that featured public dancing, song, and games designed to bring young people together under the watchful but slightly distracted eye of their elders. And what flirting it is! You spin clumsily. Your sleeve gets tangled in a ribbon. Someone's cousin elbows you, possibly on purpose. And yet, you manage to link hands. Briefly. Gloriously. The crowd shifts and your palms meet like it was fate. Or more accurately, like you both elbowed the same man out of the way at the same time. The touch is nothing and everything. Warm, solid, real, not ink, not metaphor, just skin and shared breath, and the knowledge that yes, you're both here. Later, under the pretense of helping with firewood for the evening bonfire, you get a moment alone. Not completely alone, obviously. There's a bard vomiting behind the stables and 3 chickens judging you, but still, this is it. You speak, really speak. How was your winter? They smile. Colder without your metaphors. You laugh, quietly, because laughter is as intimate as touch. And, for once, your words aren't coded. They're clumsy, honest. You tell them you missed them. You tell them your favorite letter was the one in the chestnut. They say the rosemary ink nearly gave you away when their mother sniffed their gloves. It's ridiculous, beautiful, a quirky tidbit. In some parts of medieval Europe, spring festivals included matchmaking games where girls would hide tokens for boys to find, sort of like courtship hide and seek. You consider proposing this as a tradition. Then you remember how bad you are at hide and seek. The fire is lit. The music begins again. Couples are forming. Some will last until morning. Some will result in whispered deals, chaperoned meetings, or outright proposals. Others will end in a disagreement over who actually owns that goat. But you're here, together, for now. You dance again, more confidently this time. Maybe it's the cider, maybe it's the candlelight, maybe it's the small miracle of standing near someone you've only known through the shape of their handwriting. They step closer, not scandalously so, just enough to say, "I'm still here." The night deepens, stories are told. Someone tries to juggle turnips and fails spectacularly. You sit beside each other on a hay bale that pokes all the wrong places, but you don't move. Your shoulders brush. Once, then again. You pretend not to notice. You both smile anyway. This moment is more intimate than any poem, because this is public affection disguised as nothing. There's no token, no note, no secret phrase, just shared breath under festival stars and a silence that says everything. You don't kiss. Of course not. That would be reckless, foolish, obvious. But when you leave, walking away in opposite directions under the pretense of finding more cider, your hands graze one last time, and in that brief touch, all the letters, all the longing, all the waiting becomes something real. You walk home through the dark, your feet damp from dewy grass, your head spinning with possibility. You pass Margaret. She looks at you, says nothing, just hums a hymn under her breath and keeps walking. You're not sure what that means, but tonight you're going to count it as approval. You're older now. Not old, just older. The ribbons are still tied at the maypole each year, but the thrill doesn't hit quite the same. The tokens have grown dusty in a chest somewhere. You still keep the carved pendant, though. You still glance at it when no one's looking, because life, well, it got practical. Romance, once steeped in candlelight and coded glances, has given way to muddy boots, aching backs, and the simple silent rhythm of surviving together. You share food now, tools, complaints about the weather, and somewhere between fixing the roof and tending turnips, love went from poetry to partnership. You're not noble, you're a peasant, and in this world, that means everything is earned, including affection. You remember those long letters you used to write. These days, you barely have time to write your name on the tithe register. Not that anyone cares about your handwriting anymore. Now, they care if you've cured the meat properly, if your firewood's dry, if your spouse has stopped eyeing the neighbor's pig with envy. Historians still argue whether peasant marriages were devoid of affection or simply undocumented. There's truth in both. While many unions were arranged or expected, others grew from proximity, friendship, or the wild, rebellious act of liking someone who makes decent cheese. Mainstream fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, peasants could actually choose their partners, especially if they were free tenants rather than serfs. Love-based marriages weren't unheard of, but they were still governed by necessity more than desire. So how did you choose? You didn't look for a singer of songs or a poet with soulful eyes. You looked for someone who could sharpen a scythe, someone whose cart didn't break every other week, someone who, when you were too tired to cook, handed you soup and didn't talk about it. You remember the moment clearly, not romantic, just real. They were standing in a field, swearing at a stubborn ox, hair plastered to their forehead with sweat and defiance. And you thought, yes, that one. You brought them a bucket of water. They nodded. You nodded. And that was the beginning of something less dramatic, but far more durable. There were no grand confessions, just the slow, quiet accumulation of trust. You learned their habits, their silences, the way they tie knots too tight, or how they forget to put out the fire unless reminded twice. You learned to live with the quirks, and they, somehow, learned to live with yours. A quirky tidbit, some peasant couples sealed their commitment not with a church ceremony, but with a hand fasting, or even a public declaration made before witnesses at the town boundary stone. Practical, legal, zero lace. You didn't wear white. There wasn't enough linen for that. You wore your best tunic, patched but clean, and they wore boots that didn't match. The ceremony was short. The priest muttered. A chicken wandered through halfway. You both said yes like it was a business agreement, which it kind of was. But later, when you shared bread by the fire, sitting shoulder to shoulder in silence, it felt right. This wasn't courtly love. It wasn't tragic longing or veiled poetry. It was knowing someone would carry the water when your back gave out, that they'd cover the roof while you mended boots, that you'd bury their dog beside yours without saying a word. Romantic, not in the way bards sing about, but enduring. Absolutely. Sometimes you miss the thrill of secrecy, the letters, the risk, but you don't miss the uncertainty. Now, when they say they're going to the market, they actually go. When they hand you a token, it's not a ribbon, it's a sharpened knife or a bowl of stew. You treasure both. Your love lives in the work, in the calluses on both your hands, in the shared goals. Fix the fence, get through winter, raise the goats without losing any to wolves this time. You have disagreements, of course. They like storing onions near the flour. You hate that. You snore. They kick. But neither of you leaves. You both remember when love was an idea, a poem, a gesture. Now it's a roof that doesn't leak. Sometimes they surprise you with a new cup, a flower tucked in a bundle of herbs, a rare smile that isn't about anything at all, just you. And on days when the fields are muddy and your knees ache and the dog throws up something it should not have eaten, you look at them across the room and think, thank the saints I didn't end up with that courtly love nonsense, because this is peasant love. No bard will write a song about it, but it's real. And it holds. One evening, you sit in the stoop together, no words, just watching the stars creep out behind clouds shaped like old memories. You nudge them with your shoulder. They nudge back. You don't need to say it. You already know. Love here is less of a story and more of a season, one that keeps returning year after year, like spring mud and the smell of home. You stand still, sweaty, stiff, and dressed in your second-best tunic, the one with the embroidery you pretended not to care about, but absolutely chose with intent. The church bell is ringing. The priest is muttering in Latin you don't understand. And across from you stands someone you technically already know everything about, except whether they snore, burn stew, or secretly hate goats. Congratulations. It's your wedding day. There's no orchestra, no vows you wrote yourselves, no three-tiered cake, unless you count that stack of barley loaves someone arranged on a stool. But it's official, you're getting married, not because of love, not entirely. You're getting married because your parents agreed to it, because the land needs to be managed, dowries exchanged, and property documented, because your aunt whispered that if you waited much longer, people would start to talk. Marriage in the Middle Ages is not a union of souls. It's a contract with livestock. Mainstream fact: in medieval Europe, marriage was often more about family alliances, property transfers, and social obligation than personal affection. The church gradually standardized marriage as a sacrament, but legal marriages could still be arranged privately, even verbally, as long as there were witnesses. You already went through the negotiations. His family offered 1 cow, 3 geese, and a keg of mead. Yours countered with a parcel of cabbage land and a decent set of wooden spoons. After 2 meetings, 1 shouted argument, and a spilled jug of cider, the terms were settled. You agreed. Kind of. Not yes, exactly. but enough nodding and, if it pleases, to move things along. Today's the formality. The priest reads the banns. Those are public announcements of your marriage intentions, and mutters a few warnings about sin and duty. Then comes the joining of hands. Literal, sweaty-palmed, awkward hand-holding while everyone stares. You sneak a glance at your soon-to-be spouse. They look calm, not thrilled, not horrified, just present. That's already a good sign. Then come the vows. You're expected to promise to honor, obey, and keep the fire going. That last one is implied. You say the words. Your mouth is dry, not from nerves, but because your cousin dared you to drink that medicinal ale an hour ago. A quirky tidbit. In some rural ceremonies, couples stood on opposite sides of a stream or threshold to symbolize the crossing over into new life. Others involved symbolic bride prices paid in onions, salted meat, or even a particularly good goat. The ceremony ends with a nod from the priest and a muttered amen. That's it. No, you may kiss the bride, just a general shuffle toward the stew pots and a relieved sigh from the woman who's been holding your mother's weeping veil. You're now legally and spiritually bound to another human. You're seated side by side at the feast, which includes bread, ale, a boiled something that might have once been a pheasant, and a surprisingly good apple tart. People cheer. You smile. You try not to spill on your tunic. You exchange a glance again, this one a little longer. That night, the bed is made with fresh straw. The room is full of relatives pretending not to look before they finally file out, giggling and giving pointed suggestions about fruitful unions. You lie next to each other, and it's awkward and real and nothing like the poems. You whisper something, they whisper something back, you laugh, and for the first time, you think, maybe this will work. Because marriage isn't about the perfect moment. It's about many moments. Some mundane, some absurd, some quietly wonderful. The next morning, you wake up early to find they've already lit the fire. There's warm bread. You nod. They nod. A new routine begins. Soon, your lives mesh together. You split chores, fight about stew thickness, and debate the correct way to thatch a roof. But you also share warmth, jokes, the occasional nudge of knees under the table. This is love, medieval style, not grand, not tragic, just practical and persistent. And on certain mornings, when the sun hits their hair just right, you feel something ancient and quiet stir inside you. Not the flutter of courtly poems, but the steady, grounding knowledge that you're home. You didn't plan this. You weren't even supposed to be at the monastery. But the sheep broke loose, again, and while chasing one particularly defiant ewe named Matilda across a damp hillside, you stumbled upon a man with a book and a frown and sandals far too clean for this weather. He helped you catch the sheep. You laughed. He didn't. And just like that, you were caught in a different kind of entanglement, one with fewer wool-related injuries and more forbidden glances across the cloister. You didn't mean to fall for a monk, or maybe he wasn't a monk. Not officially, not yet. Novices are tricky like that, half committed to heaven, half committed to the garden schedule. But either way, you knew the rules. No touching, no writing, definitely no eloping. So of course, you start doing all three. Historians still argue whether such affairs were rare exceptions or unspoken norms hidden behind layers of ecclesiastical denial. But you've read the faces of people at market when someone lingers too long beside the basil. You've heard the jokes. You're not the first. Mainstream fact: monastic vows were taken seriously, but breaches were more common than the church liked to admit. Monks and nuns caught in romantic relationships could face exile, penance, or even imprisonment, but many found ways to bend the rules or disappear entirely. At first, it's all words. You exchange greetings about the weather, classic seduction. Then you move to metaphors. You mention lambs. He mentions sin. Somewhere between theology and agriculture, a secret language forms. You see him weekly. Under the pretense of selling herbs, you meet in the outer garden. You talk about philosophy, about frost, about whether geese have souls. You try not to notice the way his hands tremble when he hands you a parchment. An excerpt from Augustine, with your name slipped in between the margins. It escalates. Of course it does. One night, you find a note under a pile of kindling near the chapel. It reads, "If I left, would you follow?" You read it 3 times. Burn it. Then rewrite it in your head 100 times more. You don't answer, not right away. But the next time you pass him in the corridor, you don't step aside. You don't nod. You pause. That pause says everything. And just like that, you're planning an elopement. You have no real plan. You know 3 roads, none of them paved, and one leads directly to your aunt's house, which is out of the question. You pack a sack, bread, dried apples, 2 coins, 1 pair of worn shoes, and hope. A quirky tidbit: runaway couples in medieval times often sought shelter with sympathetic clergy, especially in smaller parishes where records were sparse and oversight laxer. Some priests even specialized in discreet unions. You pray you'll find one. You leave at dawn. The sky is gray. The world is quiet. The sheep are, for once, not escaping. It's the perfect moment to disappear. He's waiting where he said he'd be, by the old oak, the one that looks like it's judging everyone. He's out of breath, underdressed, and holding a copy of The Consolation of Philosophy. You don't question the priorities. You walk together. The path is narrow. You say very little. There's no music, no triumph, just cold fingers and shared silence, and the knowledge that you're breaking rules written in ink and blood and centuries of tradition. But you also feel free. The wind on your face isn't just wind, it's possibility. You're scared. Of course you are. The world is big. The church is powerful. And your shoes are already blistering. But for the first time in a long while, your heart isn't folded in metaphor. It's wide open. You cross into the next shire by midday. There's a priest there, old, near blind, mostly deaf, but he performs the ceremony with a grin and a shrug, says something about God seeing what he wants to see. You both laugh and cry and eat a very underwhelming wedding biscuit someone left behind from the last christening. That night, you sleep beside each other under a roof made of questionable thatch and enormous spiders. It's perfect, not because it's easy, but because it's yours. You know it won't be simple. You'll have to move again, keep quiet, rewrite your past. You'll be watched, judged, possibly excommunicated. But in that rickety bed, with your stolen love snoring gently beside you and a mouse nibbling your bootlace, you feel something holy. Because love, when it's real, even if it's wrong by every rule book, is a kind of rebellion. And tonight, rebellion tastes like dry bread and freedom. Married life begins with hope, and exactly 36 hours later with disappointment. Not dramatic disappointment. You're not heartbroken. You're not betrayed. You're just cohabitating. which in the 14th century means realizing your beloved leaves their hose in a pile, can't sharpen a knife to save their life, and insists on singing 2 full verses of an extremely off-key harvest chant before breakfast. It's fine. Mostly, you wake up to cold air and the sight of them drooling onto the shared straw mattress. You share a blanket. You share a basin. You share everything except, mysteriously, the concept of cleaning up after yourself. The passion that sparked over letters and stolen festival glances now exists in grunts and sideways nods. You try not to get annoyed when they salt the porridge after you've already tasted it. They sigh every time you forget to close the shutters properly. This is love, the long-term edition, and it's very human. Mainstream fact. In medieval marriages, especially among peasants and townsfolk, there were few legal avenues for divorce, and annulments were rare. Most couples simply endured. The average person expected marriage to be a permanent, and often imperfect, arrangement. It doesn't help that you now live with your in-laws. That's right, the entire family. His mother thinks you use too much time. Her father thinks you're lazy because you sit while mending boots. The younger sibling likes to recite your bedtime conversation to neighbors. You start carving out small pieces of privacy. A walk to the well, a long trip to collect firewood. You once volunteered to clean the pig pen just to avoid another family discussion about chimney soot. Historians still argue whether medieval couples had emotional intimacy similar to modern relationships. Some sources suggest marriages were cold, utilitarian. Others reveal warmth and mutual support through letters, wills, and joint labor. Truth, likely somewhere in between. Messy, flawed, but not without affection. And that affection does grow. Awkwardly, like a crooked carrot. They remember how you like your stew. You notice they never forget to bring back a sprig of mint, even when it's barely in season. You bicker, yes, but it never escalates. You both understand that survival takes more energy than long arguments. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval couples used symbolic gestures to express love, like hand squeezing during church or leaving small gifts in work shoes. Once your partner leaves a smooth stone shaped vaguely like a heart beside your morning bread, you pretend not to care. You absolutely care. One day, the roof leaks. A beam cracks. The fire goes out. Everything falls apart at once. You're tired, soaked, furious, and ready to scream. Instead, they hand you a dry cloak. Say nothing. Just sit beside you in silence while the rain drums on the thatch like mocking laughter. And somehow, that means more than 1,000 whispered sonnets. There are good days. The market trip where they barter the best apples. The morning they fix the fence without being asked. The way they bring your cousin's baby to you when you need a reminder that life isn't always this hard. There are bad days. The stew burns. They forget your shared Saints' Day. You cry into a pile of onions and say it's the fumes. You go to bed with your backs turned, facing opposite walls of the same cold room. But the next day, they put extra honey in your bread. That's how it works now. Not grand gestures, not dramatic apologies, just showing up again the next morning, hauling wood and silently placing a mug in your hand. Love, at this stage, is passive-aggressive comfort. You insult each other's sewing. You laugh at each other's snoring. You argue about whose turn it is to fetch water and then go together anyway. It's ridiculous. It's functional. It's oddly beautiful. You sometimes think back to the days of letters and longing, of uncertainty and metaphor. You miss the fire of it, the thrill. But when your partner sneezes loudly and says, "Must be your cooking," and you both snort into your mugs, you realize this is its own kind of romance. Quieter, but real. And when you wake up one night to find them tucking the blanket back over your shoulders without knowing you're awake, you smile into the darkness. Because yes, they snore. They forget things. They argue about stew. But they also stayed. And sometimes staying, through boredom, frustration, mildew, and all, is the loudest way to say, "I love you," the Middle Ages ever allowed. There's a knock at the door. Slow, deliberate, the kind that comes with bad news or a request to borrow onions. You open it and find Father Eustace, holding a scroll and wearing the kind of expression usually reserved for people who've just stepped in cow dung. It's not bad news, not exactly, but it's official. You've been selected. For what? Census duty. Yes, you, esteemed spouse, reluctant housekeeper, occasional dreamer, are now in charge of counting things. People, goats, pigs, spouses, more goats, and reporting it all to someone who still uses the word ye unironically. Welcome to the bureaucratic side of medieval life. Mainstream fact: medieval Europe saw numerous censuses, tax rolls, and surveys. Most famously, the Domesday Book of 1086 in England, which was an exhaustive record of land, livestock, and people for administrative control and taxation. So now, instead of peeling turnips or cleaning the hearth, you're tallying your neighbor's children while pretending not to judge how many of them are named John. At first, it's exciting. You feel important. You get to carry a satchel. You develop what you think is a governmental stride. But within a week, you've been bitten by a goose, yelled at by a widow who thinks you're spying for Satan, and offered a bribe in the form of fermented honey. You refuse, mostly because it smells like a dying flower. Your spouse watches all of this with a smirk and exactly zero intention of helping. This is what you get, they say, for spelling your name too neatly on the tithe form. You're not just counting things, you're seeing things. You see the hidden grief in a man who lost 3 sons to the last winter, the pride in a woman showing off her prize pumpkin, the frustration in a family trying to explain why their one-legged uncle keeps moving between houses to avoid the hearth tax. Historians still argue whether medieval record-keeping was a tool for oppression or a sign of advancing civic life. The truth is, it was both, a way to control people and a way to make their lives visible. A quirky tidbit: some medieval censuses recorded bizarre categories like useless mouths, non-working dependents, falcons, yes, actual birds, and loud women. You're tempted to invent one just to describe your neighbor's daughter who screams at clouds. And amidst this paperwork, well, parchment work, something strange happens. You begin to feel connected to the village, to its rhythms, to the people who once seemed like background characters in your personal drama. You come home one evening, tired, mud-caked, and emotionally drained. Your spouse is already inside, poking the fire with the kind of intensity usually reserved for failed sourdough. You sit. You don't speak. They hand you a bowl of soup. It's too salty. You don't care. I met a man with 6 goats and a wooden leg, you say. They nod. That's Morris. He cheats at dice. And just like that, the conversation flows. The census, this annoying, time-consuming task, has shifted something in your marriage. You talk more, not just about chores or weather or who burned the stew, but about people. Possibility. What comes after? You begin to wonder what your life might look like somewhere else. Another village, a different town. You imagine a place where you're not just someone's spouse or someone's child, but someone who carries stories. You don't say this aloud, not yet, but they seem to know. They mention casually that there's work near the riverport, that they heard about land being cleared 3 shires over, that your name, thanks to census duty, is known now. And names carry power. You look at them, not with longing or obligation, but with something warmer, trust, because you both survived the awkward first months, the burned food, the broken roof, the goat-related arguments, and now, somehow, you've found a rhythm. It's not grand, it's not easy, but it's honest. And as you sit beside each other in the flickering firelight, you realize something. Love doesn't just survive hardship. Sometimes it's forged in it. Tomorrow you'll count sheep again, maybe argue about taxes. But tonight you share a bowl of salty soup, a crooked smile, and a quiet sense that maybe, just maybe, you're starting to build something real. Not just a marriage, a life. You're late to the harvest again. Not that you overslept. Nobody oversleeps when roosters are involved. But you lingered at the well, watching the sunrise smear gold over damp fields, pretending for just a minute that your back doesn't ache and your hands don't feel like raw rope. It's autumn and everything is heavy. The wheat, the sky, your heart. Your spouse is already in the field, sleeves rolled, brows furrowed, hands in constant motion. They barely glance up when you arrive, but there's a tiny nod, your secret hello. You take your place. You bend. You cut. You bundle. This is life now, working side by side without fanfare, without words, just sweat and shared rhythm. Mainstream fact. For medieval peasants, the autumn harvest was the most crucial and grueling period of the year. A successful harvest meant survival. A failed one could mean hunger, debt, or death. And so, you work, hour after hour. At noon, you sit on a rock and eat stale bread. Someone jokes that your turnips are smaller than last year. You joke back that his brain is too. Laughter rolls down the furrows like warm butter, and for a moment, the exhaustion lifts. Later that week, there's a storm, not just rain, a full thrashing tantrum of wind and water that threatens to drown your crops, your house, and your mood. You and your spouse run into the field with canvas, sticks, anything you can find. You scream instructions, they scream back. The wind eats most of your words. When it's over, you're soaked, mud-caked, but alive. The house is intact. The worst of the grain is safe. You collapse by the hearth that night, side by side, not even pretending to talk, just breathing. They fall asleep first, mouth slightly open, snoring like a tired donkey. You smile. This is not the love you imagined, but it is a love that stays. Historians still argue whether peasant marriages had space for emotional support amid unrelenting labor. The romantic in you says yes. The realist in you says, if not support, at least companionship. A quiet understanding that the world is too big to face alone. And you do understand each other. You know when to speak, when to stay silent, when to bring them wild herbs to rub on aching joints, when to joke, when to just sit and watch the fire together. You've become two bodies in one rhythm. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval couples celebrated successful harvests with small personal rituals, like burying a coin under the hearth for luck, or braiding wheat stalks into charms. This year, your spouse leaves one of those braids on your pillow. You pretend not to see it. You sleep beside it all the same. Winter looms again. You feel it in the air, the way birds begin to vanish, the way the sun hesitates to rise. You plan together, salt the meat, store the onions, patch the walls with a little more urgency. You don't talk about the last winter, when the food almost ran out and tempers nearly did too. But the memory is there, behind your eyes, urging you forward. And in the middle of all this preparation, you get news. Your cousin in the next shire fell sick. It's not just coughs and chills, something worse. You pack food, wrap cloth around your face, and prepare to go. Your spouse doesn't stop you. They just hand you a warmer cloak and press a dried flower into your hand. Come back, they say. Don't take too long. It's not poetry, but it lands deeper than any verse. You leave. The road is rough. The sickness is worse than you feared. But you help. You endure. You miss home. Not just the bed or the fire or your dented cup, but them. The way they hum while chopping wood. The way they groan at your jokes, but always listen. The way they make the world feel less impossible. When you return weeks later, thin and tired and full of smoke, they don't run to you. They just open the door, take your bag, and say, "Soup's hot. You'll want extra salt." You eat together. You say little, but you sit close. Too close for accident. And you know, they missed you too. Because this is what your marriage is now. Not sparks or drama, but presence. And it's enough. More than enough. There's a new sound in the house. Tiny, erratic, like a drunken bird tap dancing on a wooden table. It's not a ghost. It's feet. Soft, clumsy, rapidly growing feet that belong to a person who used to live inside you, or your spouse, depending on biology, and who now screams like a banshee whenever their porridge is too warm. Yes, your parents now. There was no warning other than the obvious swelling, the whispers, the overly confident midwife, and the night of shrieking followed by complete silence that nearly broke you in half. And then a cry, a loud, healthy, perfect, terrifying cry. Mainstream fact, infant mortality in the medieval period was tragically high. Many families lost children before their first year. Yet parents still celebrated births with joy and feared them with equal intensity. You hold this new person and wonder what you're supposed to do. No one tells you the part about never sleeping again, about how small shoulders can carry your entire heart in them, about the way a baby's breath can smell like milk and magic and mild panic. You and your spouse become ships passing in the night, each taking turns to sleep, clean, feed, shush, and question your life decisions. You argue about everything, swaddling techniques, teething remedies, whether the baby is crying because they're cold or bored or just hate you. You try lullabies, they cry. You try silence, they cry louder. You try praying. God is quiet, but slowly, so slowly, you begin to learn, and so do they. They sleep longer. You blink, and a month has passed. Their eyes start to follow you. Their fingers wrap around yours like they already own you. And they do. A quirky tidbit, some medieval families hung protective herbs like rue or fennel above the baby's cradle to ward off spirits. Your spouse hangs 5. You add a 6th just in case. The first laugh feels like sunlight. You don't remember who coaxed it. You both claim credit. You bring the baby to the fields in a sling. They coo at birds, scream at sheep, and attempt to eat a caterpillar. You beam like you invented parenthood. Your spouse mutters something about worms. And now your tiny house feels crowded, full, alive, but also fragile. Because now you're not just surviving for yourselves. There's someone small and soft depending on your ability to keep the fire burning and the wolves at bay. You worry constantly. Are they too thin, too hot, too cold? Are you teaching them the right things? Should they be making that noise? Should their ears look like that? Your spouse tries to help. They're better at diaper tying, worse at lullabies, but masterful at inventing games that involve spoons, mud, and improbable sound effects. You begin to look at them differently now, not just as a partner or a companion, but as the other half of a miracle. Historians still argue whether medieval parenting was emotionally invested or merely utilitarian. The records are mostly silent, but a worn-out wooden toy, a preserved swaddling cloth, a parent's prayer scrawled in the back of a psalter, all hint at tenderness. One night, the baby gets a fever. It comes suddenly, violently. You and your spouse trade shifts soaking cloths in cold water, whispering nonsense and pretending you're not terrified. At one point, you hold hands under the blanket, not for comfort, but to stay grounded. The fever breaks by dawn. You both cry harder than the baby. Afterwards, something changes. Not with the baby, with you. You're softer now, slower, kinder. You say, "I love you" more often, not as a declaration, but as a reminder. You kiss your spouse's hand when they're not looking. They brush hair from your eyes without teasing you. Your life is no longer your own. It belongs to this small human with food on their face and a vendetta against naps. And yet, your world feels bigger because now your days have purpose beyond hunger and harvests. You wake up to tiny babbles and sticky hands. You go to sleep to the sound of breathing you'd give your life to protect. You teach them words, how to walk, how to laugh at thunder. And one day, when they ask why the sky changes color, you give them the best answer you can, because you were once a poet, once a dreamer, once someone who saw more than just mud and meat and manuscripts. And you still are. Now, through their eyes, you remember. The world is wide. The world is hard. But the world is wonderful, especially when seen from the lap of someone who loves you without knowing why. The air smells different now. Less of smoke and salt, more of dust and memory. Your child is taller. Their voice has changed. They argue more. They sing less. They ask questions you can't answer and laugh at jokes you don't understand. And you creak, not dramatically, just a little more than before. Your hands are stiff in the morning. Your knees predict the weather with alarming accuracy. Your spouse grunts more when standing. You both have that sigh, the one that says, "We're not old, but we're not young either." But somehow, that sigh is comforting. This season of life isn't marked by milestones. It's defined by quiet persistence, by habits so entrenched you no longer notice them. The way they hand you the ladle without asking, or how you both count the eggs without needing to speak. Mainstream fact, life expectancy in the medieval era was low on average, around 30 to 40 years. But that's heavily skewed by infant and child mortality. If someone survived childhood, they could live into their 50s or 60s, especially in rural areas with consistent food and less exposure to urban diseases. You've made it further than many. Now your world has narrowed in the best way. You know your neighbors. You know which chickens lay the sneaky eggs. You know where the best mushrooms grow and which trees drop their leaves first. And you know each other intimately, annoyingly, lovingly. You can predict each other's sneezes. You know when to speak and when to let silence be its own comfort. You've fought about the same stew recipe for 20 years, and still, every week, it's made the exact same way, with too much rosemary. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had personal happiness or merely endured. But you're not a theory. You're a person who's laughed until they choked on mead and cried into their spouse's shoulder when the first goat died. You've known sorrow, known loss. One winter, the fever came back, not to your child, but to your neighbors. You helped bury her. You watched your child watch you grieve and learned the cruel, kind truth that life continues anyway. Your spouse didn't say a word that night, just sat beside you, holding your hand so tight you forgot to cry. That's what love is now. Not words, not grand gestures, but presence. A quirky tidbit. In some villages, couples who survived 20 or 30 years of marriage were granted ceremonial blessings by the local clergy, a sort of medieval vow renewal. You and your spouse skipped the ceremony, but you did split the last apple tart evenly. That's basically the same thing. Your child is grown now. Not entirely, but close. They talk about other towns, about travel, about seeing the sea, which you've only ever heard described by peddlers and priests. They ask if you ever thought of leaving. You don't answer, not because you didn't, but because you did. Often. But every time something tethered you here. A root, a hand, a heartbeat in a dark room that whispered, "Stay." Just a little longer. You've built something, not a castle, not a legend, but a life stitched from love and flower and sun-warmed wood. A house full of worn chairs, mismatched cups, and memories too loud to fit in any book. And your spouse. They still hum, still mutter when the stew burns, still squeeze your hand during storms, though they'll never admit it's out of fear. You sleep closer now, not out of passion, but because your backs hurt less when you're curled together like two spoons in a drawer that's seen better days. And when they snore, you nudge them. They wake, they grumble, you both laugh. Again, because love at this stage is a loop, familiar, predictable, precious. And when the child finally does leave, promising to write to return, you and your spouse stand together, waving like fools, already missing them, and quietly savoring the silence. You eat dinner in peace, just the two of you again, like it once was, like it is now, like it might be for however many seasons you have left. And as you sit by the fire, knitting, sharpening, muttering, smiling, you realize something. You outlasted it all. The hunger, the winters, the fear. You stayed, you built, you endured, you loved. The fire is low now, not out, just soft. A quiet glow that hums against the stone like a memory you don't need to chase. Your hands rest in your lap, worn, weathered, gentle. Across the room, they breathe, slow, steady. You know that rhythm like you know your own name. Outside, the night is deep. No storms, no wolves, no harvest to tend. Just stars, cold and constant, scattered across the dark like chalk dust on velvet. You listen to the creak of the chair, to the distant owl, to the silence that somehow no longer feels empty. This is what peace sounds like. You've lived through so much. Droughts, floods, births, deaths. You've made stew too thin and porridge too salty. You've sung lullabies and dug graves. You've whispered prayers into the cold and cursed blisters under your breath. You've loved with your whole body, even when that love didn't always feel poetic, even when it looked more like mending clothes and sharing soup. and not walking away when the hard days outnumbered the good. And now, the hard days don't scare you. You've faced them before, and always you remained. Maybe you didn't change the world, but you changed someone's world. That child who learned to laugh from you, that neighbor who needed a loaf of bread, that stranger who heard your story centuries later and finally understood that survival isn't just about strength. It's about staying soft in a world that hardens everything. You did that, and you didn't do it alone. So tonight, as your bones relax and the fire sinks into ash, let yourself be proud. Not loud, not grand, just proud. Because you made it. You lived an ordinary life in extraordinary times. You turned simple days into sacred ones. You held fast to love, to purpose, to quiet joy. Now close your eyes, let the room darken, let your breath slow, and know that somewhere, maybe far away, maybe just inside your own chest, the story you built still glows, steady, warm, eternal. Good night, traveler of time. Sleep well. You're home.